Hi guys, so this is a mini lecture that I'm going to go over infection, transmission, and epidemiology. For those of you who haven't had microbiology or this is something that you need a refresher on, this is just to give you some background on infection and transmission, okay? So what happens in your body when you're infected, when you have an infection? And first of all, there's usually an incubation period. And this is the time where you have initial contact with the infectious agent, or maybe it's moved to a different part of the body and it's that initial start of the infection. And this is before the appearance of symptoms, so up until the appearance of symptoms. During the incubation period, the microbe is multiplying at that portal of entry we talked about in the last lecture, but it has not caused enough damage that you actually have any symptoms. And this can vary according to the host resistance, also how virulent the pathogen is, and then also the distance between the target organ and the portal of entry. So perhaps the portal of entry is the mouth and the distance would be to the large intestines. It can range from several hours to even up to several years depending on what it is, but the majority of infections will range from 2 to 30 days, this incubation period. After the incubation period, you will see a prodromal stage, and this is a 1 to 2 day period when the earliest notable symptoms of the infection appear. And generally, it's kind of a vague feeling of discomfort. It's not any specific symptom. It's more just muscle and headaches, fatigue, maybe your stomach doesn't feel great, and in general, just malaise. The next stage after that is the period of invasion, and this is where that infectious agent, the microbe, multiplies very, very quickly and at high levels. It will have its greatest toxicity and becomes well established in that host tissue. It's generally marked by fever and other specific signs and symptoms, and this part is extremely variable in the length of time, and that can be due to the health of the host or how virulent the microbe is. And then once we've gone through that very symptomatic stage, we'll enter the convalescent period. And this is when we start to feel better and begin to respond to that infection and the symptoms start to go down. Generally, the host strength and health will gradually return. And part of that is just our immune response responding to this infection. Now, often this is when people stop taking their antibiotics, even though they've been told to take them for 10 days because you start feeling better and you think, I don't need the antibiotics. This is why some pathogens are still in their system and can have antibiotic resistance because they haven't completely been killed off. You haven't completely ended the infection, you're just feeling better. So some terms that are good to know when we're talking about getting and transmitting infectious disease. The first is communicable, and this is a disease in which an infected host can actually transmit the microbe to another host, and then it gets established in that second host. Infectious and communicable are actually synonyms. You can use them interchangeably. Contagious is different than infectious. Contagious is a disease that is highly communicable, so it's easy to get. Some that would be influenza and measles. And when we look back on the Ebola outbreak that we had last year, it is not one that's considered contagious. It is infectious, but it's not contagious. It's not easily transmitted by a sneeze, for example. And then we have those that are non-communicable, and these are infectious diseases that you do not get from one host to another host. And this, generally speaking, when we're looking at somebody who has a compromised immune system, and they can be invaded by their own microbiota. So it may go to a different part of the body, and because they're immunocompromised, it will cause an infection. It can also be accidental contact with a microbe that exists in a non-living reservoir, so not from host to host. Perhaps you picked it up from the soil or something. And in this case, infected persons do not become a source of disease to others. Okay? That's why it's considered non-communicable. Now, when we look at communicable disease, this can be through direct or indirect contact, either with another human or maybe with something that they've touched, so an inanimate object. Horizontal transfer refers to disease that's spread from one population to another, so from one person to another. Vertical transfer would be the disease is transmitted from a parent to offspring, and in that case it might be from either delivery during birth, or perhaps it's through breastfeeding. There are two major modes of transmission: direct contact, and then indirect transmission is when some vehicle is involved. Perhaps it's, we'll go into that in just a second. So we also have something that is called nosocomial infections, and this is where the hospital is the source of the disease. And the big one here would be Clostridium difficile. If any of you have looked at the wiki, or perhaps that's your pet microbe, you know that that is one that is very common in the hospital. And on average, 5% of all admitted patients will end up with an infection that they've acquired from a hospital stay. Unfortunately, this can go to 2 to 4 million cases a year and up to 90,000 deaths. And this is a huge burden financially also. When we look at disease in large populations, we call that epidemiology, and it's the study of how often and how far distributed a disease might be in a defined population. And this involves a lot of different disciplines, microbiology being one of them, but also anatomy, physiology, and so on. And this is looking at all forms of disease, from anything from heart disease, a chronic disease like heart disease, cancer, drug addiction, and mental illness. So when we look at epidemiology, we're looking at things like the frequency of the case, and that would be prevalence, the total number of existing cases with respect to the entire population. And this is reported as a percentage of the population. So we might say that, influenza during the month of December has a 8% infection rate in a particular population. Incidence is a little different. It's measured by the number of new cases over a certain time period, and it can also be called the case or morbidity rate, and this indicates the rate and risk of infection. Incidence and prevalence are followed over a seasonal, yearly, and long-term basis. So seasonally, we see that a lot with influenza. We talk about the incidence rate. We also have statistics that have to do with how many people die from an infection, and mortality rate would be that. It measures the total number of deaths in a population due to a certain disease. And then the overall death rate from infectious diseases, when it has dropped, there is still the number of persons afflicted with infectious rates or morbidity rate can remain high. So mortality is the rate of death, and morbidity is the rate of infection. We also have the index case. This would be the first person found in the epidemiological investigation, often referred to as patient 1. And it may not be the first case of the disease, but it is the first case that brought attention to it, to the officials. Lastly, there's a few vocabulary words that may help you while you're reading. Endemic is an infection that will be relatively steady frequency over a long period of time in a particular geographic locale. And often we say malaria is endemic to portions of Africa, and that's it. There's a steady frequency of it in a particular region over a long period of time. We can have sporadic, which means that there are occasional cases and they're very irregular intervals at random locales. And then when is something an epidemic? This is when the statistics indicate that the prevalence of the disease is increasing beyond what is expected for a population. Pandemic refers to when it actually crosses continents. So an epidemic spreads from continent to continent. Okay? So hopefully this is a little bit of background or information that can help you as you go forward researching your microbe.